In the fluorescent glow of the boutique, a silence cut sharper than any blade filled the room the moment Rebecca Miller, the store's manager, raised her hand and delivered a slap that echoed across the polished marble floors, the sound of crocheting off glass displays and hanging chandeliers until the entire place froze in collective disbelief as her voice, drenched in venom and arrogance, followed that slap with words that carved humiliation deeper than any bruise could. You don't belong here. This isn't some charity handout thrift shop. Security. Escort this woman out now. And every shopper, every employee, every bystander turned their heads toward the unfolding confrontation that was no longer just a store policy dispute, but an open wound of cruelty laid bare in public. Their eyes locked on the woman who had been struck, a woman who, instead of collapsing under the weight of public humiliation, stood unshaken, her composure like steel forged in fire, her dignity radiating stronger than the aggression aimed to break it. Her name was Cassandra Brooks, a 53-year-old black woman who had seen the world at its ugliest, but had risen higher than anyone in that store could have imagined. And in this moment she did not cry out. She did not retaliate with anger. She did not even appear surprised. Instead, she did something that chilled Rebecca to her core. She smiled, not the fragile smile of someone masking pain, not the hollow smile of shock, but a slow, knowing, amused smile, a smile that whispered of knowledge hidden, power restrained, and destiny unfolding, a smile that suggested Cassandra knew something Rebecca and her loyal crew did not. And in the seconds that followed, the air thick with tension, the room holding its breath, the impossible truth would begin to unravel, because no one present knew who Cassandra really was, and no one expected the storm about to be unleashed. But to fully understand how this ordinary day turned into an extraordinary reckoning, we must rewind the clock, peeling back the hours to when Cassandra first walked through those glass doors 8 hours earlier, disguised in the simplicity of worn jeans, a faded cardigan, and sneakers that had seen better days. Nothing about her outward appearance hinted at the reality that this woman commanded a fortune of $2.9 billion, that she was the founder and chairwoman of one of the largest retail conglomerates in the country, with 900 stores operating coast to coast. Her empire built from the ashes of poverty and discrimination, her wealth a fortress constructed brick by brick through resilience, sacrifice, and vision. But unlike other billionaires who wrapped themselves in luxury brands and armored themselves with chauffeurs and private jets, Cassandra deliberately chose to walk the world in modest attire. She drove an old Toyota instead of a Rolls Royce. She carried a canvas bag instead of a designer purse, because every day she reminded herself of the life she came from, of the mother who once wept in a grocery store parking lot after being told by a clerk that people like her didn't deserve service, of the humiliations that burned scars into her childhood, of the hunger she endured when her family was dismissed by systems that judged worth by skin color and wallet size. Cassandra had sworn an oath in those years of struggle that if she ever rose to power, she would never forget her roots, never become blind to the struggles of ordinary people, and most importantly, never tolerate the abuse of dignity in spaces meant for all. And yet on this very morning she chose this boutique, a store owned under franchise licensing her own corporation's brand, to walk in anonymously, not to shop but to observe, because Cassandra believed true leadership wasn't built in corner offices or boardrooms, but in seeing the reality at ground level. And little did she know she was about to witness firsthand the rot festering under her very nose, rot in the form of Rebecca Miller, the 44-year-old manager who had ruled this boutique with an iron fist for 12 years, a woman who had clawed her way from sales clerk to manager but had grown bitter, insecure, and obsessed with status. Rebecca wore her blonde hair in a meticulously maintained bob, dressed herself in designer clothes she could barely afford, and lived her life determined to distance herself from the working-class background she came from, her childhood one of cramped apartments and constant reminders that she was not enough. So when she finally landed the manager's chair, she vowed she would never again be associated with anything that made her feel inferior, and she built her management style around one ruthless philosophy: protect the prestige image of the store at all costs, which meant, in her twisted view, keeping out anyone who looked like they didn't belong to the world of wealth and privilege. And to enforce this philosophy, she surrounded herself with a loyal inner circle who carried out her silent policies without question, starting with Natalie Ruiz, a 29-year-old single mother who had been working the boutique for 3 years, Terrified of losing the paycheck that supported her young daughter, Natalie often swallowed her discomfort at Rebecca's cruelty because survival demanded compliance. Then there was Daniel Price, 36, an assistant manager who had been promoted twice under Rebecca's wing, genuinely believing she was a mentor, who understood class and refinement, blindly loyal to her methods because his career depended on her approval. Then came Chloe Benson, the youngest of them all at just 23, a cashier who idolized Rebecca and believed she was being trained to understand real business. Chloe mimicked Rebecca's cold demeanor, convinced that ruthlessness equaled professionalism. And standing behind them, silent yet ever-present, was Frank Donovan, the 34-year-old security guard who trusted Rebecca's judgment, completely, never questioning her decisions because he believed she represented authority and order. And adding to this toxic ecosystem was Margaret Hale, a wealthy 70-year-old patron who had appointed herself as the boutique's unofficial gatekeeper, a woman who spent thousands every month and used that financial leverage to push her elitist views on who was worthy of entering such a store. Her friendship with Rebecca, making her feel like she had the right to police other customers. Together, this group formed Rebecca's silent army, an echo chamber that reinforced her biases and emboldened her cruelty. But what none of them knew was that their arrogance, their blind loyalty, their complicity in injustice would soon shatter in the most spectacular way because Cassandra Brooks, the woman they chose to humiliate, held the power to dismantle their careers, their reputations, and their illusions with single command. And as the day unfolded, small interactions began to set the stage for the eruption. Cassandra had walked in quietly that morning, browsing shelves with the calm ease of someone invisible. Yet every movement she made was watched with suspicion by Rebecca, who whispered to Natalie to keep an eye on her, her tone dripping with disdain. "She looks like trouble," she said, while Margaret narrowed her eyes and muttered to Chloe, "This is why standards matter. People like that bring down the whole atmosphere." Chloe nodded eagerly, not realizing she was participating in a narrative of prejudice that would soon explode in her face. Daniel, standing nearby, pretended to be professional but secretly agreed with Rebecca, reinforcing his belief that appearance equaled worth, and Frank, receiving a subtle signal from Rebecca, stayed closer to Cassandra than necessary, his presence a shadow meant to intimidate. Yet through it all Cassandra noticed every glare, every whisper, every judgmental glance. She felt them, but she did not shrink. Instead, she carried on, touching fabrics, examining shoes, quietly observing not the products but the people, because she was there to see if her stores upheld the values she had sworn to build into her empire. And with every passing minute her heart sank, until finally the moment came when Rebecca, emboldened by Margaret's approving gaze and her staff's silent support, confronted Cassandra directly near the jewelry counter. Her words, sharp and unprovoked, "Ma'am, this section is for serious buyers only. I think you should head somewhere more appropriate for your budget." Cassandra looked at her calmly, responded with nothing but a raised eyebrow, and that silent refusal to be diminished lit Rebecca's insecurity like gasoline to flame, until in front of everyone she raised her hand and delivered the slap heard across the boutique, sealing her fate. And in the seconds afterward, Cassandra's knowing smile, her calm dignity, shook the entire room to its core. Because beneath that smile lay truth. This woman they had deemed unworthy, this woman they had treated as disposable, was the very owner of the empire that paid their salaries, the architect of the brand they worshipped, the billionaire who could erase their careers with a single phone call. And as the reveal unfolded, as Cassandra finally spoke and introduced herself, shock rippled through every face. Fear crept into every loyalist's eyes, and Rebecca's empire of cruelty crumbled in an instant, because in humiliating the very person who gave her power, she had written the end of her reign with her own hand. And what followed that day would be remembered not just as a dramatic firing, but as a lesson in dignity, respect, and the unshakable truth that arrogance built on prejudice always falls before humility armed with power. 8 hours earlier, Cassandra Brooks had stepped into her own store for what she thought would be a routine unannounced inspection, the kind she often carried out because she knew the only way to truly understand her empire was to walk through it like any ordinary customer and see how people behaved when they didn't know the owner was watching. And though Cassandra had been CEO and founder of Brooks Lifestyle Group for over 2 decades, controlling more than 900 locations across the nation, she never forgot the promise she had made to herself as a child, that if she ever held power, she would keep her ear to the ground and her eyes on the truth, never let herself be blinded by boardroom reports and polished presentations, which is why she had come quietly and alone to Store 52 that morning after receiving several anonymous letters that unsettled her deeply, letters that spoke of discrimination, favoritism, humiliation, and toxic behavior from management toward both employees and customers. And Cassandra, who had endured those same injustices in her youth, could not ignore them. So there she was, dressed in her usual modest way, faded jeans that had been washed 100 times, a gray cardigan with slightly frayed sleeves, sneakers that had carried her through years of long walks and memories, and a simple canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Nothing about her outward appearance suggested billionaire, nothing whispered wealth. She blended in seamlessly with the shoppers, except for the poise in her walk and the quiet confidence in her eyes. Yet that very simplicity was what lit the fuse of prejudice in the heart of Rebecca Miller, the 44-year-old manager of the boutique who had built her entire fragile identity on guarding what she thought was exclusivity. Rebecca spotted Cassandra almost immediately, her eyes narrowing with suspicion the moment she noticed the modest clothes, the absence of designer labels, and she made a snap judgment, as she had done 1,000 times before, branding Cassandra as someone who did not belong, a trespasser in her curated world of polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and luxury handbags. And from that moment, Rebecca was no longer thinking of store operations or customer service. She was thinking of putting on a performance of exclusion, a show of dominance to remind her staff and her wealthy patrons that she was the gatekeeper of refinement. So she approached Cassandra with a practiced smile, one that did not reach her eyes but was dripping with condescension. Her voice honeyed yet sharp as she said, "Oh, sweetheart, are you lost? The discount store is down the street." And those words, laced with arrogance, struck like a slap before any hand had been raised. Cassandra, maintaining her calm composure, turned to her and replied softly, "No, I'm exactly where I need to be," her tone even, her dignity intact. But Rebecca was not satisfied. Normal kindness would have ended the exchange there, perhaps even offered assistance. But Rebecca's insecurities and prejudices burned too hot. She looked Cassandra up and down, sneered slightly, and leaned in with sarcasm dripping from every syllable. "Sweetie, I don't think you realize what kind of establishment this is. These aren't exactly yard sale prices." The way she elongated "sweetie" was like poison, an intentional belittling meant to strip Cassandra worth in front of others. And as fate would have it, nearby stood Margaret Hale, a 70-year-old wealthy patron who had become Rebecca's greatest enabler, a woman who spent thousands every month in the store and fancied herself a guardian of its so-called prestige. Margaret heard Rebecca's tone and chuckled approvingly, her laughter like fuel thrown on the fire, and Rebecca, emboldened by this validation, raised her voice just enough so other customers could hear. "We serve a very exclusive clientele here, people with real money to spend." The words carried through the store like a challenge, drawing curious eyes, whispers beginning to ripple as shoppers realized something was unfolding by the jewelry counter. Cassandra, refusing to be provoked, moved with elegance to the glass case displaying diamond bracelets, her interest genuine because these were her products, her brand, her responsibility. She was mentally noting the display arrangement, the lighting, the upkeep, but Rebecca misread the action as audacity, seeing Cassandra dare to approach the high-value merchandise as an affront, so she followed with her voice sharpened into cruelty. "Darling, that bracelet costs more than most people's rent. For 6 months, maybe you'd be more comfortable at the bargain section in Target." And she laughed mockingly, a hollow laugh meant not for Cassandra, but for the audience that had now grown larger. Customers abandoning their browsing to witness the unfolding drama. Employees shifting nervously yet saying nothing, their silence complicit, their eyes darting between Rebecca's smirk and Cassandra's composed face, and Rebecca, sensing the growing crowd, realized she had a stage. So she decided to perform louder, crueler, more vicious. Turning not just to Cassandra, but to the people watching, she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when you don't set standards. People wander and thinking they belong in places that are clearly out of their league." Margaret clapped her jeweled hands together softly in amusement. Chloe Benson, the young cashier of 23 who idolized Rebecca, giggled uncertainly. Daniel Price, the assistant manager, crossed his arms and nodded, convinced Rebecca was protecting the store's integrity, while Frank Donovan, the security guard, lingered close, awaiting a signal, his loyalty to Rebecca making him a silent enforcer. And Natalie Ruiz, the single-mother cashier, shifted uncomfortably behind the register, her stomach churning because she recognized the ugliness in Rebecca's words, but her need to keep her job forced her lips shut. Cassandra, observing every expression, every reaction, stored it all away, her heart, both heavy and resolute. Because this was confirmation of the letters she had received. This was a rod in her empire, right before her eyes. But she kept her silence, only tilting her head slightly and offering Rebecca the smallest of amused smiles, a smile that carried centuries of resilience, a smile that made Rebecca's stomach knot in confusion, because it was not the smile of defeat, but of someone holding a secret. And just as the tension reached its breaking point, Rebecca decided to push it further. She stepped closer, raised her hand, and with arrogance overflowing, she delivered a slap across Cassandra's cheek, the sound echoing like thunder in the marble chamber, gasps erupting from the crowd. Shopping bags froze in midair, a child clutching her mother's hand, asking in confusion what had happened. Silence heavy as stone settled, all eyes on Cassandra, waiting for her to crumble, to protest, to weep. But Cassandra did none of that. She calmly lifted her hand, wiped the cheek that burned from impact, and smiled again, this time broader, a smile that sent icy dread down Rebecca's spine, a smile that said the game was over, though Rebecca did not yet realize it. And then Cassandra spoke for the first time with deliberate clarity. "That's quite bold of you to strike the woman who owns this entire chain." Her words slicing through the room like a blade, silence deepening as understanding rippled, gasps turning into murmurs, Margaret's face blanching, Chloe's eyes widening in horror, Daniel's arms dropping uselessly at his side, Natalie covering her mouth in shock, Frank frozen like a statue unsure of his orders now, and Rebecca, her face draining of color, her confidence collapsing, whispered trembling, "What?" To which Cassandra responded firmly, "My name is Cassandra Brooks, founder and CEO of Brooks Lifestyle Group, the very company that writes your paycheck, the very company you just disgraced with your behavior." The revelation detonated like an explosion in the boutique. Customers whispering frantically, some pulling out phones to record, others shaking their heads in disgust at Rebecca, employees staring at Cassandra with newfound awe and terror, Rebecca stumbling back, her mind racing, realizing she had not just humiliated a stranger, but the one person she could least afford to offend, and Cassandra, never raising her voice, continued. "I came here today because I received reports of discrimination, reports of poor treatment. I didn't expect to be the target myself, but I see now those reports were true." Her words laced with both sorrow and power, and in that moment every person in the boutique understood a reckoning was at hand. Rebecca stammered, "I didn't know, I didn't realize." But Cassandra cut her off gently yet firmly. "That is a problem. You never care to realize you judge based on clothes, based on skin, based on assumptions. And today your prejudice has written the end of your own career. She turned to the stunned crowd and added, "No customer, no employee, no human being deserves this kind of treatment in any of my stores." Her declaration sparking applause from some, tears from others, phones capturing every second, the moment destined to spread beyond those walls. And as Rebecca sank into a chair defeated, Cassandra called Daniel over and said calmly, "As of this moment, you are suspended pending review. All of you who enabled this will face accountability." Her gaze sweeping over Chloe, Daniel, Frank, and even Margaret, whose face was red with shame. And finally Cassandra turned toward Natalie, the one whose discomfort had been visible, and said softly, "You stood in silence, but I saw your conflict. I'll speak with you privately later." And with that, Cassandra pulled out her phone, called her corporate office, and in front of everyone instructed that Rebecca Miller be terminated effective immediately. Her career ending in the same place she had humiliated countless others, and the crowd erupted, some in applause, some in stunned silence, all in all the poetic justice that had unfolded. And as Cassandra left the store that afternoon, the same modest sneakers carrying her back to her old Toyota, she knew this day would be remembered as more than just an inspection. It would be remembered as proof that dignity cannot be bought, that arrogance crumbles before humility, and that true power is not in wealth or status, but in the unyielding demand for respect. Some people just don't understand their place in the world. Do they? That thought flashed through Veronica Hale's mind as she observed the scene unfolding in her boutique, though she wasn't the type to speak it aloud. Across the store, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, actually chuckled and whispered to his companion, "She's got a point." A woman nearby nodded in agreement, her voice a hushed murmur to her friend, confirming that the crowd was encouraging the spectacle, feeding off the humiliation of the woman at the center, a woman they believed didn't belong, a woman who somehow dared to challenge the invisible hierarchy Veronica's manager had meticulously crafted. The manager, Simone Archer, a sharply dressed 42-year-old with a razor-sharp bob and an air of superiority, thrived on this kind of energy. She could sense the crowd's fascination, the thrill of public judgment, and she absorbed it like a predator. Her voice carried over the polished marble floors, ringing with artificial sweetness and venom all at once. "Ma'am, I'm trying to save you from the embarrassment of being declined when you can't possibly afford our payment plans," she said, drawing out each word as though they were a blade aimed directly at the woman in front of her. Standing nearby, a tall man with a stern face and perfectly combed dark hair, Jackson Reed, 36, Simone's second in command, positioned himself strategically, exuding authority without saying a word. His body language signaled complete loyalty to Simone. He believed, utterly and without question, that she was protecting the integrity of the boutique. Years of shared victories and whispered corporate philosophies had cemented that belief into an unshakable faith. Behind the cash register, a young mother named Elena Vargas, 28, her hands trembling ever so slightly, watched the confrontation with silent horror. She knew in her gut that what was happening was wrong, but the unspoken rules of the boutique made survival a matter of compliance. Her young son depended entirely on her paycheck, and Simone had made it clear that loyalty was everything in this store. No hesitation, no questioning, or your position could vanish in an instant. But then the woman being ridiculed did something that turned the entire scenario on its head. She walked calmly to the dress section, a $5,000 designer piece hanging in the VIP display, and reached out to inspect it. This action sent Simone into a state of ecstasy, her eyes lighting up as though she had been handed the perfect weapon. "Attention, everyone!" Simone bellowed, her arms sweeping across the store, demanding attention. This lady wants to try on one of our $5,000 dresses. Instantly, every shopper froze. Phones came out. Heads turned. Customers abandoned their browsing. Employees stopped in their tracks. And even a security guard, a bulky man named Marcus Kane, 32, stationed near the entrance, halted mid-step. The entire store became a single collective gaze locked on the woman who dared. Simone's voice rang with theatrical authority. "Should I remind you, ma'am, that our fitting rooms require a full credit verification before any purchase?" Nervous murmurs rippled through the audience. Some laughter, some whispers, some a mixture of awe and horror. Amber Lewis, a 24-year-old cashier who idolized Simone and mimicked her every inflection, giggled aloud, saying, "Miss Archer is so funny." That laugh alone gave Simone even more fuel, more confidence. She was performing, working the crowd like a seasoned comedian on stage, scrutinizing her target with exaggerated care. "Honey," Simone sneered, her eyes narrowing, "that dress costs more than your car is worth. Assuming you even have a car and didn't take the bus here." The cruelty in her tone was breathtaking, surgical in its intent, a deliberate attempt to make the woman before her feel small, worthless, and publicly humiliated. And it worked, or so Simone thought. The crowd responded exactly as she hoped. Some laughed, some nodded approvingly, and a few, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the momentum, simply looked away. Margaret Ellison, the 71-year-old regular who had become Simone's most loyal ally, decided to join in, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Really, dear, there are plenty of lovely stores better suited to your budget." The words were not directed at her for help, but at reinforcing the spectacle. The woman, however, remained unfazed. Her poise was uncanny. Her name was Evelyn Drake, 51, a self-made billionaire who had risen from poverty to build a retail empire of over 920 stores nationwide. She had dressed simply for this visit, worn jeans, a cashmere sweater, and sneakers that had carried her across countless factory floors, boardrooms, and small-town shop openings. To Simone, Evelyn looked like any other ordinary shopper, but to Evelyn, the world she was observing was full of people mistaking appearances for truth, small minds believing they could wield power over someone infinitely greater than themselves. Evelyn, showing no fear, asked calmly, "May I speak with the manager, please?" This simple, polite request, rather than defusing the situation, sent Simone into full performance mode. She threw her arms wide, turned to face the crowd as though announcing the arrival of a rare spectacle. "Congratulations," she said theatrically, her voice rich with condescension. "You're looking at her, and I'm telling you, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, wearing the wrong clothes." The words reverberated through the boutique, each syllable calculated for maximum humiliation. Phones were raised. The crowd size grew as whispers spread. A confrontation was happening, and some instinctively recorded it, knowing social media would delight in this drama. Simone fed off the energy, turning the entire store into her stage. "Let me guess," she continued, eyes gleaming. "You saw this place on Instagram and thought you could pretend to shop? Well, this isn't dress-up time." Jackson Reed finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative, meant to support Simone's act. "Ma'am, our boutique has standards, and you seem unaware of them," he said, almost as a warning, almost as a performance of his own. Meanwhile, Elena, trapped behind the counter, clutched the edge of the register, her knuckles white, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Evelyn, however, moved with unshakable grace. She wandered toward a display of handbags, examining them casually, ignoring the theatrics. Every step she took was deliberate. She was studying not just the products, but the behaviors, the reactions, the human flaws on display. Simone noticed this, her mind struggling to contain the fact that the woman before her exuded power and composure in a way Simone could never imitate. That realization was dangerous, and so she escalated. "Darling," Simone said, voice laced with venom, "do you even understand how much these bags cost? Are you sure you aren't just here to gawk?" The words were meant to wound. Jackson Reed shifted slightly. Marcus Kane stepped closer, their presence an unspoken threat, reinforcing Simone's power. Amber Lewis clapped lightly, her admiration for Simone unquestioned. But the crowd's fascination began to shift. Some of the more perceptive customers exchanged uneasy glances. Others who had initially laughed now hesitated, sensing an undercurrent of tension they didn't fully understand. Margaret Ellison, initially gleeful, noticed a subtle calm authority in Evelyn's stance, a quiet power that made even her wealthy self feel small. The shift was almost imperceptible, but real. Evelyn finally approached the fitting room, her every movement deliberate, her gaze steady. "I'd like to try on this dress," she said simply, as though she were requesting nothing more than basic human decency. Simone's eyes narrowed, the crowd hanging on every word, waiting to see whether she would maintain control or falter. In that moment, the boutique seemed suspended in time. Every whispered conversation, every nervous chuckle, every phone camera pointed at Evelyn became part of an invisible web, capturing humiliation, anticipation, and the brewing reckoning. Simone, desperate to assert dominance, waved her arms theatrically, calling out, "Everyone, witness this." This is what happens when someone steps out of their place. A person who clearly cannot afford our standards believes they belong here. Her voice was amplified by the crowd's reactions, but Evelyn did not flinch. She did not stumble. She simply smiled faintly, a knowing, almost amused smile that seemed to say she understood the play but had her own script. The tension escalated as employees whispered among themselves, some internally questioning the morality of their complicity, others hiding behind loyalty to Simone. Jackson Reed, attempting to maintain a facade of neutrality, observed Evelyn's calm poise, feeling the first seeds of doubt. Elena's hand stopped trembling slightly as she realized that the woman in front of them commanded more authority in silence than Simone could ever wield with words. Marcus Kane, who had relied entirely on Simone's judgment, now hesitated, sensing that the situation had spun beyond control. Evelyn approached the fitting room door, her movements fluid, deliberate. "I'd like to try this on now," she repeated politely. Simone, sensing the climax of her performance, raised her voice once more. "Before anyone thinks about fitting room policy, let me remind you, a full credit verification is required, something most people here simply cannot pass." The crowd laughed nervously, some recording the moment, unaware of the true stakes. Amber Lewis giggled again, prompting Simone to beam, but Evelyn's smile did not waver. It was then that Evelyn subtly shifted, stepping forward with quiet confidence, and said softly, "I am the owner of this store, the one who oversees every policy, every employee, and every customer experience. And today, you have chosen to humiliate me publicly." A hush fell. Phones froze midair. The crowd could not comprehend the revelation. Simone's mouth opened, but no sound came. Jackson Reed's jaw tightened. Elena froze entirely. Margaret Ellison's eyes widened. Marcus Kane stiffened. The atmosphere changed from entertainment to reckoning in an instant. Evelyn's calm authority radiated through the boutique. She spoke, her voice soft but commanding. "I came here because I received reports of discrimination, mistreatment, and arrogance. I did not expect to be the target myself, but you confirmed every concern." Simone, once so powerful, now felt an overwhelming tide of shame and fear. Her performance had backfired catastrophically. She stammered, I didn't know. But Evelyn held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Ignorance is no excuse. Your actions have consequences, and today you will face them." Evelyn turned to the stunned crowd. No customer, no employee, and no human being should ever be treated like this. Applause broke out from some. Phones recorded the confrontation, and the scene quickly began to go viral, capturing not just humiliation, but justice being served. She instructed Jackson Reed to suspend Simone immediately, along with any employee complicit in this behavior, while ensuring that Elena, who had shown hesitation and moral awareness, would be treated fairly. Margaret Ellison, realizing the error of her arrogance, shrank back into silence. The boutique, once a stage for cruelty, had become a theater of accountability. By the time Evelyn left the store, walking calmly to her modest car, the reality was clear. Dignity could not be bought. Arrogance always collapses under truth, and real power lies not in wealth or status, but in the unshakable commitment to respect and integrity. The day had begun with a performance of humiliation, but it ended with a lesson in justice that no one present would ever forget. A day when the world, even if just a small corner of it, remembered who truly held power.